Hello again, 122, to conclude Chapter 22 on China and Japan from the late 18th century through about 1911. Japan's going to join the club. We got to get into the club because it is pretty apparent to Japanese. The lessons of history are clear. We've been emulating some Western ideas in education. We're trying to modernize our economy, and we're also watching what they're doing in foreign policy. They've amassed wealth and power not only because of their democratic systems and high levels of education, but also because of their colonies. The Japanese began their program of territorial expansion close to home. And we'll look at that map at the end of this video. In 1874, after a brief conflict with China, Japan was able to claim suzerainty or control over the Ryukyu Islands, long a tributary to the Chinese Empire. 2 years later, Japanese naval pressure forced Korea to open 3 ports to Japanese commerce. And during the 19th century, very early on, Korea had tried to follow Japan's example, and they attempted to isolate itself from outside contact, except for periodic tribute missions to China, and there were missionaries there, mostly Chinese of the French, and they were vigorously persecuted in the 1800s. The Yi dynasty sought to strengthen the country by returning to traditional values and fending off outside intrusion, but rural poverty and official corruption remained rampant. And a U.S. fleet actually tried to open the country as they did in Japan in 1871, but it was driven off with considerable loss of life. In 1876, Korea agreed to open 3 ports to Japanese commerce in return for Japanese recognition of Korean independence. And during the 1880s, the Sino-Japanese rivalry over Korea intensified, and this is the beginning of Japanese imperialism in the Pacific. When a new peasant rebellion broke out in Korea in 1894, China and Japan intervened on opposite sides. And in the 7th edition of the text, you can read both declarations of war, one by a Japanese individual and another by a Chinese individual. During the war, the Japanese Navy destroyed the Chinese fleet, and they seized the Manchurian city of Port Arthur. In the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Chinese were forced to recognize the independence of Korea and cede Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula with its strategic naval base at Port Arthur to Japan. But shortly afterwards, under pressure from the Europeans, the Japanese returned the Liaodong Peninsula to China. But early in the 20th century, they went back on the offensive because of rivalry with Russia over influence in Korea, and this led to increasingly strained relations between the two countries. And in 1904, this is the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, they launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur, which the Russians had taken from China in 1898. We don't want you Japanese to have it, but we'll take it for ourselves instead. And the Japanese armed forces, their army was not very strong, but Russia faced difficult logistical problems along its new Trans-Siberian Railway and severe political instability at home. We'll talk about that later in the semester. The Duma is called by Tsar Nicholas II. It hadn't met in hundreds of years. And in 1905, that's really the beginning of the end of the Romanov dynasty. And eventually, the revolution will happen in 1917. More on that later. In 1905, the Japanese warships sank almost the entire Russian fleet off the coast of Korea. And then the Russians agreed to a humiliating peace. This shocked the world, ceding the Liaodong Peninsula back to Japan, as well as the southern Sakhalin Islands and the Kuril Islands. And Russia also agreed to abandon its political and economic influence in Korea and southern Manchuria, which now came increasingly under Japanese control. As mentioned, this victory stunned the world, including the colonial peoples of Southeast Asia, who now began to realize that the white race was not necessarily invincible. And during the next few years, the Japanese consolidated their position in northeastern Asia. They annexed Korea and make it a colony in 1908. And it's now considered to be part of Japan. And when the Koreans protested, Japanese reprisals resulted in thousands of deaths, creating long-lived animosity between the two countries. The United States was one of the first to recognize this annexation, though. In return, quid pro quo, realpolitik, ladies and gentlemen, for Tokyo's direct declaration of respect for United States authority in the Philippines. In 1908, the United States recognized Japanese interests in the region in return for the Japanese acceptance of the principles of the open door. But there's now mutual suspicion between the two countries because of U.S. efforts to restrict immigration from all Asian countries. And that will result in the Taft-Katsura Agreement, a gentleman's agreement, which further talked about these issues between the U.S. and Japan. And then later on, the Root-Takahara Treaty, which will again restrict Japanese immigration in return for no United States interference with what they're doing in Korea. And here we have a nice map of Japanese overseas expansion during the Meiji period. Originally, at the end of 1875, this lighter color is what Japan looks like. You got a Hokkaido up here and Honshu, Shikoku, Kyushu, and then the acquisition of Ryukyu. And the gold will take place in the aftermath of the First Sino-Japanese War. And then eventually spheres of influence will come in after the Germans are removed from the picture at the conclusion of the First World War. Those are the orange-colored regions. Now Japan has a foothold in the mainland, and eventually in the 1930s and 1931, southern Manchuria will become the puppet state of Manchukuo, and that will become the jumping-off point for the invasion of mainland China in 1937. That will be the Second Sino-Japanese War, and that's really the beginning of the Second World War in the Pacific. And that just about concludes Chapter 22.